Hi, Dr. John Torres here. On my daily doc, where a couple times a week I go over headlines, particularly headlines surrounding the pandemic, coronavirus, and things that you need to understand a little bit better because sometimes those headlines can be a bit confusing. We get below those headlines, give you the information that hopefully you can use to help you, your family, your loved ones, and your community get through this pandemic as quickly and as healthy as possible. I also often add other news that might be out there as well, as we're starting to head more into types of news that are non-pandemic related, but in this case it'll be mostly pandemic. And then I answer questions you have. So if you have questions, please send them our way. I try to get to as many of those as possible. And I want to start off first by telling you I haven't been on air for a few weeks because I was away doing some work in Europe. I was actually in Latvia and in Ireland. It was an interesting experience because it turns out, number one, to get there, had to make sure that I had my COVID vaccine paperwork. I had my COVID card showing that I'd been fully vaccinated, and I must have shown that 100 times in that 2 weeks I was out there because every place you went, before you got on the airplane, once you got to certain areas, to get inside any restaurant, any coffee shop, anything out there, you had to show that pass. Now, there was a bit of confusion because we are one of the few countries, and particularly one of the few developed countries, that doesn't have it digitally. All we have is a paper card. If you go to Europe, they have a digital pass, and it's called a QR code that they have on their phone, and they show the person at the restaurant, the coffee shop, wherever they are, and they scan that, and it gives them the information they need. We don't have that. We just had to show them the card, which confused them a little bit in some areas. Places where they'd seen the card before, not so bad. Places where they hadn't, oftentimes it confused them, and sometimes they simply wouldn't let us in. They simply said, you can't come in because we don't understand that card and we don't know if it's accurate. And so they turned us away at the door because we didn't have the pass that they're used to. Now, hopefully here in the U.S., especially now that they're mandating vaccines in a lot of areas and they're pushing for more vaccine mandates in other areas, hopefully they come out with some type of digital passport or digital certificate, if you'd rather use that word, to show that we are fully vaccinated, because I think we're going to need that going forward, especially as things open up around the world. Now, the government has already said, the White House and President Biden has said they don't want to get involved with that. Not sure I understand completely why, but that would be the entity to work. It's something at the national level. Otherwise, it has to go through all 50 states. And a while ago, I did a story with IBM talking about their digital health pass. And they said one of the reasons they were having a hard time right now is because there was nothing on a national level. They could do it at other nations because other nations have it at the national level, and they're able to get the information they need there to be able to give you an accurate certificate showing that you've been vaccinated in a digital form on your phone. But here in the U.S., we don't have that. So that means they'd have to go to every state of the 50 states. Each state has different ways of recording that. They have different computer systems, and so it would be nearly impossible for them to get all that in a timely fashion. And so they were telling me, and this was a few months ago, that at the national level, having that would make it much easier for people to be able to get that certificate and be able to use it so you don't have to carry that card with you. Like I said, some places simply don't recognize it. Other places, have a hard time reading it, and then you could possibly lose it as well. And it's certainly going to wear out after a certain amount of time because it is cardboard. It is just a piece of paper. But that was my experience out there. Coming back, had to test before we came back because the U.S. requires that. I'm 3 days into getting back, and so now I have to take a COVID test, which I'll be taking over the next couple of days, which is per the CDC CDC guidelines for returning from international travel. And then good to go after that. And so again, it was an interesting experience seeing how other parts of the world are dealing with this. When we were in Latvia, every place you went, 100% of the time, I did not see a single person indoors without a mask. It was highly enforced. They really didn't have to say much. People would just walk around outdoors without a mask. As soon as they stepped through that threshold, boom, mask came on, and they did whatever they were doing in there with their mask. Obviously, they ate or drank, they took it off, but then put it right back on before they left. And it was just common for them and not a big issue. And you're seeing it in their case numbers drop. Our case numbers, and I'll certainly talk about those, are trending down, but there's concern they might go back up again, especially with the winter months coming and people congregating indoors. Right now, we're at about 90,000 cases per day. That is significantly less than the 150,000 we had just a few weeks ago, and it's great that it's dropping so quickly. But at the same time, we need to keep on our toes because it is possible it could go back up. This last one was our fourth wave. We don't want a fifth wave to happen But again, we need to keep vigilant because we need to do those things we know can help keep it under control. Masking, social distancing, especially if we go indoors, avoiding large crowds, hand washing or sanitizing, those things can certainly help. And then ventilating. Indoors, you want to make sure that things are as ventilated as much as possible to try and keep the virus controlled as much as possible as well. But those vaccinations, I'll talk about what's going on in the vaccination front here, are something that's important and have become an issue around the country because of the mandates that are being placed in different areas around the country, and I think there'll be more to come. They're talking about maybe even mandating it for domestic travel. They've already mandated it for international travel, not from the U.S. perspective of leaving, but from the perspective of other countries as accepting you as a guest in their country. And they're talking about opening up U.S. travel to foreigners here, at the same time saying they need to be vaccinated before they come here. So again, you can see what's happening around the world. Vaccines are becoming more and more important, and I think it'll be with us for the rest of our life anyway. It might be something that is required. Now, going back in history a little bit, my experience in the military is because of my travels in the military, you were vaccinated with yellow fever because you might go to a country where yellow fever is endemic. In other words, it's there. You need to be protected against it. And the World Health Organization actually puts out, they call it the yellow card. It's a vaccination card. And on that card, it says you were vaccinated for yellow fever and when it was. You would have to carry that card with you and show it around the world if you went into an area where they required it. That was normal. We all did that if we needed to go to those areas. Well, this is one step further because it's the vaccination that the world is getting. And so you can see that happening around the world as well. And so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out over time. But again, our cases are coming down here. There are a few states, a handful of states where it's still going up a little bit, but overall seems to be coming down. We want to make sure, especially with the holidays coming up, that it stays down. And the CDC is talking about holiday time periods, and we'll talk about that as time goes on over the next few weeks. For right now, they're mainly talking about Halloween, saying, yes, kids can and should trick or treat outdoors. If they're indoors around family members or other people who aren't vaccinated or other people who aren't necessarily from their family, especially if they're in a car, they need to keep their masks on, the windows down to protect themselves and others as well, especially since a lot of these children can't get vaccinated. But moving on to the second point, right now, the FDA this week is planning on meeting to go over Moderna and Johnson & Johnson booster shots. They're going to meet Thursday and Friday, and they're going to talk about it. This is the VRBPAC we talk about, the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. They're the advisory committee to the FDA. They're going to go over Moderna and Johnson & Johnson boosters to see if they're going to give emergency use authorization or recommend emergency use authorization for the boosters. By all indications, they will. Now, Johnson & Johnson's booster is going to be the exact same shot they got the first time. Remember, it's a one-dose shot. Moderna, they're looking at doing a half dose because they say that's all they need at this point. So that half dose, they're not putting out new vials. They're just telling providers, just take half of what you normally take and just give it to them as a booster shot at that point. It'll be interesting to see what they decide. They're also going to look at mixing and matching and whether that's something they want to recommend at this point, because you can imagine with all the vaccines that are out there, it can be confusing going to a place, you got Johnson & Johnson, you go to another place and they only have Pfizer. Can you get that or do you have to go somewhere else? It can be very confusing, so they're going to give us some information on that. If they give thumbs up for recommending the emergency use authorization, then the FDA will take that and they'll decide. Again, by all indications, they'll go ahead and give it the emergency use authorization. And then the CDC steps in, the ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, scheduled to meet next week. They'll give their recommendation on how to give it, like as in Moderna, the half shot. You'll give it to people 6 months after the last shot, these certain age groups, these certain criteria. And then if they recommend it, then the CDC will take it, Dr. Walensky, and she'll say, yes, I recommend it, or might want to change it a little bit, like she did with the Pfizer vaccine. So it'll be very interesting these next 2 weeks to see what happens with that. But that's where we are with all that going on with the shot itself, the boosters. Now, as far as children, and that's a big question I get, where are we with children? Well, the data has been submitted by Pfizer for 5 to 11-year-olds, and they are asking for emergency use authorization for them to get that 2-dose shot regime starting hopefully early November. ACIP is meeting on the 26th of October to decide on whether they want to recommend that. And if they do, the VRBPAC is meeting on the 26th of October, the FDA Advisory Committee. If they recommend it, same process. Remember, 4-step process. The VRBPAC recommends it to the FDA. The FDA accepts that recommendation and gives an emergency use authorization if they do. And then if it moves forward, ACIP, the CDC Advisory Committee, meets and they recommend how to give it, who to give it, when to give it. And then the CDC signs off on that. So it's a 4-step process. That starts October 26th with the VRBPAC meeting, the FDA subsequently after that. And then the first week of November, ACIP is scheduled to meet to decide on 5 to 11-year-olds. So theoretically, by the first week of November or the end of the first week, 5 to 11-year-olds can start getting those vaccines, and it'll be a 2-dose shot like it is with adults. So again, the 2 big things on the vaccine front, the booster shots, which it looks like this week they're meeting to talk about that. By all indications, it'll get an emergency use authorization, and ACIP can decide what to do with it at that point. Both Moderna and Johnson & Johnson booster shots, and potentially that mixing and matching. Is it something that they want to do, or they're going to recommend, or do they want to hold off on it for a while? And that one's kind of anybody's guess which way they're going to go with that. And then the CDC follow-up, and then 5 to 11-year-olds, 26th of October, and subsequently the first week of November. So it won't be before Halloween, but it'll be a little bit after Halloween before they can get their vaccines. And then 2 to 5-year-olds, it's going to be probably beginning of the year, maybe the end of this year, and then 6 months old to 2-year-olds, probably beginning of next year, maybe springtime, before they start getting all the data in. But that's where we are with all that. So let me see if you guys have any questions.
You talked about the Moderna booster, but when is the regular Moderna vaccine going to get full FDA approval?
So the Moderna vaccine is following behind the Pfizer vaccine, which has gotten approval for certain age groups. It's still under emergency use authorization for younger people, but for the age group, the adults, it's gotten full approval. Now, Moderna is putting data out there as well to try and get full approval. In the meanwhile, they're looking at getting emergency use authorization for the booster shots. But for the actual vaccine itself, the first 2 doses, they're looking for full approval. It just takes a little bit of time. And if you remember, the FDA said instead of 2 months data that we got for emergency use authorization, we want 6 months data. We want to inspect the manufacturing plants. We want to make sure everything's okay there. And then we'll look at giving it full approval. But if you remember the timeline back in January timeframe, December timeframe, Pfizer was first, and then followed by Moderna, and then Johnson & Johnson, and that's the way full approval is going as well. And then they'll start working on the ages because that's how it happened. Pfizer got emergency use authorization, and then months later it got emergency use authorization for younger ages, and now it got full approval, and months later it'll get full approval for younger ages, and Moderna is subsequently following that suit as well. So my guess is by the November, December time frame, they'll be looking at getting full approval for Moderna, probably end of the year, beginning of next year for Johnson & Johnson at that point. But it is happening. It's just happening in the order of the way the vaccines got their emergency use authorization as well.
Did the COVID vaccine cause the Delta variant?
Yeah, and I've heard this question many, many times because it is out there on social media that the COVID vaccine, according to some people, possibly caused the Delta variant because there's a theoretical possibility that might happen. But in this case, it did not happen. And here's the reason why. So there's 2 different reasons. One is the science behind the virus and how it works. So viruses are constantly changing. They're always looking for ways to become more contagious, possibly more deadly, ways to get around our immune system. And that's just the way viruses live. They've been around for billions of years, and that's how they've adapted. But they can only make that change if they get inside our bodies, inside our cells, and then they can make that change. Sometimes those changes, those mutations, are what we call deleterious. They're mutations that actually hurt the virus, make it less contagious, or less able to get around the immune system. And that's the vast majority of them. But every now and then, one mutation pops up that makes it more advantageous for the virus. It can get around our immune system. It can make it more contagious. And so that's what we're seeing with these variants, the alpha, the beta, the Delta variant. And we're seeing it become more contagious and to some extent being able to get a little bit around the immune system. But we're also finding out that the vaccines are very effective at not necessarily preventing mild disease, but at preventing us from getting seriously ill, hospitalized, or dying from the variant, which is important. But now, so that's the science behind them. So it wouldn't work unless it gets inside our body. The vaccine, it gets inside our body and it replicates inside, multiplies inside our body. The vaccine doesn't necessarily stop it from getting in our body, but it stops it from multiplying in our body. And so you're not going to have as many vaccine changes. You're not going to have the mutation. So the vaccine is going to help with that. On top of that, and again, I'm a science fiction fan, if you look at what we call the time-space continuum, the Delta variant was first discovered in India in October of 2020. So a year ago, it was first discovered in India. It started spreading in India December of 2020. That's when they noticed it spreading kind of wildly throughout the country. The first vaccine in India didn't happen until January 16th of 2021, 3 months after they discovered the Delta variant. So Delta variant, 3 months later, people started getting vaccinated. So if you look at the time scale, it could not have caused it because the vaccine came after the variant. And that's the same thing. The Alpha variant came very early on in the pandemic, way before vaccines. The Beta variant, even way before vaccines. So there's no way the vaccine could have caused it. Now, people are looking forward and they're going, wait a minute, places have gotten high vaccination rates and they've had high Delta variants as well. Well, that's true because the vaccination rates aren't catching up, aren't fast enough to overtake the spread of this Delta variant. This Delta variant is spreading very quickly. It will get it under control once enough people get vaccinated, but you have to reach that number. And right now that number is reached in very, very few areas. There's a lot of areas that still have low vaccination rates, and that's why it can spread. And if you look right now, the predominant variant here in the US is the Delta variant. 90+% are the Delta variant. And if you look at the cases in the country, those places that have low vaccination rate have high case numbers as well, which is showing you, and just the opposite, high vaccination rates, lower case numbers. So that vaccine is actually keeping the Delta variant under control, not causing it to happen more often. So again, a few different things. One is the science behind the viruses, how they work, and the other is the timeline, just the logicalness behind that timeline of how the Delta variant first discovered before the vaccines even came out, and then the vaccine subsequently came out and is keeping it under control. So hopefully that helps answer your question. But again, like I talked about, we talked about the numbers. They are coming down around 90,000 on average now over a 7-day rolling average per day, which is great, but we need to keep on our toes and make sure we keep those numbers coming down and trending down. If you remember, June, we were down to about 11,000 a day. So we still have a ways to go, and we want to get down to that level and even lower. As far as the vaccinations, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, as we speak, have submitted data to get their emergency use authorization for booster shots. FDA is looking at it. CDC is looking at it. By the end of next week, we'll have an answer. More than likely, they'll give them the emergency use authorization and the recommendation for that. And then 5 to 11-year-olds, Pfizer has submitted data. The FDA is going to look at that October 26th. CDC the week after that, so hopefully by the first week of November, they've given the authorization and recommendation for 5 to 11-year-olds to get their vaccine. But I hope you have a fantastic week. This is the beginning of the week, and it could be a long week with all the information that's coming out. When I get back on Facebook Live on Friday, I'll talk about what the FDA is looking at, what they're thinking about, and what they're talking about in their meetings, and where we think they're going to go from that, as well as any updates and any other non-COVID stories that might be out there that I think might be of interest to you. But in the meanwhile, I hope you, your family, your loved ones, and your community stay as safe as possible, as healthy as possible, and get through this pandemic as quickly as possible. Thanks.